There is a line in the after-action record of the 2nd Ranger Battalion of the United States Army that says more about these men than any monument ever could. In the days after the fighting, German prisoners were questioned about what they had just been through, and one complaint came up again and again. Their defenses, they said, had all been built to face the open fields, because that was where any sensible attacker would come. Instead, in their own words, the crazy Americans came down the road. That single sentence, written down by the Rangers themselves, is the thread that runs through this entire story. The Germans had spent years preparing for the war they expected. And then a certain kind of American soldier arrived and fought the war the Germans had not prepared for at all. This is the story of those soldiers, the men who came to be called Rudder's Rangers, and of two places where the German army learned, at terrible cost to both sides, exactly what it had run into. One was a cliff on the coast of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. The other was a bare hill in a frozen German forest 6 months later. In both places, the Rangers did things that, by the ordinary logic of war, should not have been possible. And in both places they paid for it with more than half their number. If this story matters to you, a like helps it reach other people who care about these men and what they did. And if you are new here, consider subscribing, because we tell these stories the way they deserve to be told. To understand the Rangers, you first have to understand the man who trained them and led them, because his fingerprints are on everything they became. His name was James Earl Rudder, and he was, in almost every way, an unlikely figure to end up leading one of the most dangerous assaults of the entire war. Rudder was born on the 6th of May 1910 in the small town of Eden, Texas, in the ranching country near the center of the state. He was the son of a man who worked cattle and dealt in livestock, and he grew up in a world of hard outdoor work, far from anything military or grand. He went to the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, the school known as Texas A&M, where the young men trained in a corps of cadets alongside their studies. He played center on the football team. He graduated in 1932 and took a reserve commission as a second lieutenant of infantry. And then, for years, he did not soldier at all. He taught school and he coached football, first at a high school in the town of Brady, and later back at a college in Texas. He was, in the years before the war, exactly what he appeared to be, a big, plain-spoken Texan who coached young men and knew how to build a team out of them and drive it hard. That is the thing to hold on to about Rudder. He was not a product of a military caste. He was a coach and a teacher who had kept his reserve commission, and when the country went to war, he was called to active duty, and in time, the army handed him something extraordinary. On the 30th of June 1943, he took command of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and he began turning a group of volunteers into the unit that would climb the cliff at Pointe du Hoc. And here is the single most important fact about the Rangers, the fact that everything else in this story grows out of. They were volunteers. Every man in the battalion had stepped forward for it. In the American army of that war, a commander could call for volunteers for hazardous duty, and the men who raised their hands for the Rangers were choosing, with their eyes open, the most dangerous work on offer. That changed the nature of the unit before a single shot was fired. An ordinary infantry battalion is a cross-section of whoever the draft sends. A Ranger battalion is a concentration of the men who wanted to be there, and the training that followed was built to burn away anyone who could not meet the standard. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was activated on the 1st of April 1943 at Camp Forest in Tennessee. The men came from ordinary places and ordinary jobs. They had been clerks and farmers and factory hands and students, the same raw material as any other unit, but they had volunteered, and the training set about sorting them. It was deliberately brutal, and it was meant to be. The idea was simple. Better to lose a man on a training field in Tennessee or on a cold beach in England than to lose him and the men around him in combat because he could not keep up. So the standards were set high enough that many could not meet them, and the ones who fell short were sent back to the regular army with no shame attached, and the battalion moved on without them. From Tennessee they went to the Florida coast for amphibious training, learning to bring small boats into a hostile shore and to move fast across open sand that offered nothing to hide behind. Then they crossed the Atlantic to Britain, and in Britain the training grew harder still. They were put through schools shaped by the British commandos who had spent years learning the craft of the raid, of hitting a defended coast, doing a job, and getting out. These were men who had been raiding the coast of occupied Europe since the darkest days of the war, and they held nothing back from the Americans they trained. The Rangers ran everywhere. They made speed marches over long distances under full loads, marches that would have broken ordinary infantry, and they made them against the clock. They fired live ammunition on exercises, real bullets cracking close overhead, because a man who has never heard that sound tends to freeze the first time he hears it for real, and a ranger could not afford to freeze. They practiced landing from small boats over and over, in daylight and dark, until wading ashore under a load and moving straight into action was second nature. The washing out never really stopped. A man who could not carry his share was a danger to the men beside him, and the battalion kept refining itself, shedding those who could not hold the pace, right up until it embarked for England. And, crucially, given what was waiting for them, they learned to climb. Along the cliffs of the English coast, at places chosen because the rock rose sheer out of the sea much as it did at their objective, the Rangers practiced the exact thing they would have to do on the morning of the invasion. They learned to fire ropes and grappling hooks up over a cliff edge. They learned to climb hand over hand up a swaying line with a rifle on the back and the surf below. They learned to go up tall extension ladders and to fight the moment they reached the top, because reaching the top exhausted and unready was the same as not reaching it at all. They did it in daylight and in darkness, in good weather and in rain, until the thing that Pointe du Hoc would demand of them had become something close to routine. But the physical hardness was only part of it. The deeper thing the training built was a habit of mind. Rangers were taught that the plan would break. They were taught that officers would fall, that radios would fail, that the ground would look nothing like the diagram on the briefing table. And they were taught that when that happened, the answer was not to stop and wait for orders. The answer was to understand the objective so completely that any man could pick up the mission and carry it forward. A ranger sergeant was expected to think like a ranger officer. A ranger private was expected to know what the sergeant knew. Leadership was pushed downward, spread through the whole formation, so that cutting the head off the unit did not kill the body. Hold on to that idea, because it is the center of this whole story. The German army was built on the officer as the brain of the unit, the single place where decision lived. The Rangers were built on the opposite principle, that the ability to decide had to live everywhere at once, in every rank, so that no single bullet could ever find it and end it. On the cliff at Pointe du Hoc, and later on that hill in the forest, that difference would decide who kept moving and who did not. Now to the cliff itself. Pointe du Hoc is a headland of rock and grass that juts out into the English Channel on the Normandy coast, between the two beaches the Americans would land on. On the maps, the eastern beach was code-named Omaha and the western one Utah. On top of the headland, the Germans had built a battery of 6 heavy guns, captured French pieces of 155 millimeters, set to command the sea. From that height, guns of that size could reach far out to the invasion fleet and could sweep the approaches to both American beaches. Their maximum range ran to something like 11 or 12 miles, more than enough to turn the water off those beaches into a killing ground. At the exact moment, thousands of men were wading ashore. Allied planners looked at that battery and decided it had to be destroyed in the first hour of the invasion. The only question was how to reach it. The guns sat behind a cliff. Not a bluff, not a steep hill, but a genuine wall of rock, rising close to 100 feet straight up from a thin strip of beach. There was no gentle way in. To take the battery from the sea, men would have to land on that narrow beach, at the foot of that cliff, and climb it, while German soldiers at the top shot down at them and dropped grenades on their heads. It was the kind of mission that gets handed to specialists, because ordinary infantry cannot be asked to do it. In the American Army of 1944, the specialists for a job like this were the Rangers, and the job went to Rudder. He would take roughly 225 men from 3 companies of his battalion, the companies designated Dog, Easy, and Fox to the base of that cliff. The plan depended on timing. They would land at the water's edge in the first minutes of the invasion. They would fire rockets carrying grappling hooks and ropes up over the cliff edge. They would raise ladders, including tall extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Department and mounted on amphibious trucks. They would climb under fire, reach the top, destroy the guns, and then hold the ground against the counterattack that was certain to come. If the assault force ran into serious trouble at the point, a much larger body of Rangers waiting offshore would come in behind them. Everything hinged on the first companies reaching the top and sending back a signal that the point had been taken. On the morning of the 6th of June, almost nothing went according to that plan. The small landing craft carrying the Rangers were pushed off course by the current, and the lead navigation aimed the little flotilla at the wrong headland first, a point some 3 miles to the east. The mistake had to be seen and corrected while the boats ran parallel to a coast lined with German guns, and correcting it cost more than half an hour the plan did not have. The boats took on water in the choppy sea. Men bailed with their helmets to keep the craft from going under. One landing craft carrying about 20 men swamped and sank, and its men had to be pulled from the cold water and carried back toward England, not rejoining the battalion for nearly 3 weeks. A craft loaded with supplies went down as well. The men who reached the foot of the cliff arrived soaked, seasick, and short of equipment, and the fight had not even begun. One of the men in that swamped craft was Captain Harold Slater, who commanded Dog Company, along with about 20 of his men. Slater had been so determined that his Rangers know the ground that he had drilled them to picture Point du Hoc almost blindfolded. Now, 8 miles out, his boat filled and went down, and he and his men spent hours in the cold channel before rescue craft found them and carried them back to England. Slater did not set foot in Normandy for another 19 days. He would rejoin the battalion later and fight on across Europe, but on the morning that his company needed him at the cliff, the sea had taken him out of the battle before it began. It is a small illustration of how much of this operation was decided by chance and water before any Ranger fired a shot. By the time the first Ranger craft touched the narrow beach at Point du Hoc, they were roughly 40 minutes behind schedule. 40 minutes does not sound like much. In this case, it was nearly everything. The plan had called for the Rangers to send their success signal by a set time, and for the larger force waiting offshore to steer for the point the moment that signal came. When the signal did not arrive on time, the commander of that waiting force followed his orders and turned instead for his alternate objective, Omaha Beach. So the delay did not simply cost minutes, it cost the entire reinforcement. From that moment, the couple of hundred men at the cliff were on their own, with no reserve coming behind them. Against a fortified enemy, they were about to attack straight up a wall of rock. The loss of Slater meant that the leadership of Dog Company on that beach fell, as the Ranger system intended it should, to whoever was there and able to lead. One of the men who stepped up was a lieutenant named George Kirchner. In civilian life, Kirchner had been a young man from Baltimore who had worked behind the counter of an ice cream company, and later as a railroad guard. An utterly ordinary background for a man about to help lead an assault on a fortified cliff. When the senior officers of the company were hit, Kirchner took charge of what remained and led them up and over the top and into the fight for the guns. For his leadership at Point du Hoc, he would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He was the ordinary man made into a leader, which was the whole design of the thing, and then they climbed. The rockets fired the grappling hooks up the cliff, dragging ropes behind them, though many of the ropes were so soaked with seawater and so heavy that they fell short of the top. Men climbed hand over hand up the ropes that had caught, rifles slung on their backs, while German soldiers leaned over the edge and fired down and cut ropes and threw grenades onto the men below. The tall extension ladders went up from the amphibious trucks. Rangers climbed the swaying ladders with the open sea behind them and the enemy above them, and simply kept going. Some were shot off the ropes and fell to the rocks and the wet sand at the bottom. The men behind them took hold of the same ropes and climbed anyway. They did not climb entirely without help. Out in the channel, warships had closed the shore to support them. A British destroyer, the Talibont, raked the enemy firing positions on the point, and an American destroyer, the Satterlee, stood off about 2,000 yards and fired her guns at the German positions along the cliff edge, working to drive the defenders back from the lip so the climbing men would have a chance. It was dangerous work, firing that close to your own soldiers on a cliff face, and the naval gunners did it through the morning. It should be said plainly that climbing is one of the hardest things a soldier can be asked to do under fire, to haul yourself slowly and helplessly up a fixed line while an enemy shoots down at you and you cannot shoot back. And the Rangers did it, in numbers, and they reached the top. When they came over the edge, they charged into a wasteland of craters and trenches and concrete gun positions torn up by weeks of Allied bombing and naval fire. And there they made a discovery that could have broken the whole mission. The heavy guns were not there. The concrete emplacements that were supposed to hold the great 155mm guns were empty. In their place, in some positions, the Germans had left telephone poles set up to look like gun barrels from the air. Weeks before, worried about exactly the bombing the point had been taking, the Germans had quietly pulled the real guns back and hidden them somewhere inland. So here were the Rangers, at the top of a cliff they had bled to climb, having done the impossible part, only to find that the reason for the mission had vanished. A great many soldiers in that moment would have counted the job done. The guns were not on the point. The point was taken. Dig in and wait. That is not what happened, and what did happen is one of the clearest examples of the Ranger way of thinking that the whole war produced. Two men, First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, a young man from New Jersey whom everyone called Bud, and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, pushed inland from the point on their own initiative to find the missing guns. They had no orders to do it. They understood the objective, the guns were the objective, and the guns were not where they were supposed to be, so the two sergeants went looking. They moved down a sunken country lane away from the cliff, deeper into German-held ground, and about 250 yards south of the coastal road, they found what they were looking for. 5 of the great guns, sitting camouflaged in a hedge-road position, aimed toward Utah Beach, with their ammunition stacked and ready, and no one guarding them, while a large group of German soldiers gathered in a field a short distance away. Lomell did not hesitate and did not go back for permission. While Kuhn covered him, Lomell went in among the guns. He carried thermite grenades, incendiary devices that burn at tremendous heat and can weld the moving parts of a gun into a single useless mass. He set thermite in the recoil and traversing mechanisms of 2 of the guns, disabling them, and he smashed the sights of a third with the butt of his weapon. Then he headed back for more grenades to finish the rest. And here the official army history is careful, and so this account will be careful too. Before Lomell could return, a second Ranger patrol from Easy Company, led by Staff Sergeant Frank Rapinski, came through the fields from another direction and finished the job on the remaining guns, and this patrol also destroyed the battery's stock of powder in a great explosion. So the credit belongs not to one hero, but to 2 small groups of sergeants, working separately, neither waiting for an order, both arriving at the same conclusion, that the guns had to die, and that the men standing there were the men to kill them. Within a couple of hours of reaching the top of the cliff, the entire battery that the invasion planners had feared was wrecked. Now think about what that took. No officer directed it from a command post. No plan on paper described it. The plan had already fallen apart. What remained was a set of men who understood the purpose so completely that they carried it out without being told, and that is exactly what the training had been built to produce. It is worth pausing here to answer a question that has followed Pointe du Hoc for decades. If the guns had been moved off the point, was the whole bloody climb a waste? The answer, plainly, is no. The guns the sergeants found inland were not junk pulled back to be scrapped. They were intact, they were supplied with stacked ammunition, and they were pointed toward one of the invasion beaches, ready to fire. Had the Rangers not come, those guns could have been served and turned on the ships and the men in the water. The fact that the Germans had hidden them inland did not make them harmless. It only meant that the Rangers had to go and find them, which 2 sergeants did, and destroy them, which they also did. The mission was not wasted. It was accomplished, just not in the tidy way the plan on paper had imagined. Beyond the guns, the Rangers had a second job at the point, and they did that too. They pushed inland to the coastal highway that ran behind the headland, the road that connected the German forces along that stretch of coast, and they set up a roadblock across it and held it, cutting a line the enemy needed. So in the space of a morning, a couple of hundred men who had climbed a cliff under fire had destroyed a battery of heavy guns and severed a coastal road, both of the tasks they had been sent to do, and they had done it while cut off and unsupported. While the sergeants were dealing with the guns, Rudder was on the point, running the fight from a command post scraped into the ground near the cliff edge, under fire the whole time. He was wounded twice during the 2 days at Point du Hoc and refused to be evacuated, and he stayed in command. He was not a commander watching from a ship offshore. He was on the ground his men had climbed to reach, bleeding with them, and they could see him there, which mattered more than any order. Communication was a nightmare from the first minute, because the radios had been soaked and battered in the run-in. The battalion's communications officer, Lieutenant James Eichner, a man everyone called Ike, kept trying to get word out with whatever would work. The prearranged signals were simple code words. One word sent the message that the Rangers were up the cliff, and that word was, "Praise the Lord." Another code word had already gone out earlier to tell the waiting force to follow the alternate plan and land at Omaha. When the radios failed him, Eichner fell back on older tools, including a signal lamp of a type left over from the First World War, flashing messages out to the destroyer standing offshore. Later, when the situation had grown desperate, Rudder got word out that the mission was accomplished, but that he needed ammunition and reinforcements, and had many casualties. The answer that came back was that there were no reinforcements available. They had all landed at Omaha, because taking the point turned out to be the easier part. Holding it was the ordeal. The Rangers who had climbed the cliff were few, and now they were cut off. Their reinforcements had gone to Omaha. Their radios were mostly ruined by seawater and battle. They pushed a thin screen of men inland to the coastal road, the road the Germans would have to use to bring up a counterattack, and they held a line there and back across the torn-up point. Then the Germans came for them. Through the rest of the 6th of June, through the night, and into the 7th and the 8th, the Germans counterattacked again and again, pressing the thin Ranger line in the dark, trying to drive the small force back off the point and over the cliff into the sea. Some of the hardest fighting came at night along that inland road, where German infantry pressed in close, and the Rangers, badly outnumbered, were forced back into a shrinking perimeter nearer the cliff. They ran low on ammunition almost at once, and then lower. They ran short of food and water. They took casualties they could not evacuate, because there was nowhere to send them, and so they kept their wounded with them inside the perimeter and did what they could. They held for 2 days. When relief finally reached Point du Hoc on the 8th of June, it came from forces pushing west from Omaha Beach, infantry and tanks, and the Rangers who had landed at Omaha 2 days before. Of the roughly 225 men who had landed and climbed at the point, only about 90 were still on their feet and able to bear arms. Across the whole battalion in that fight, 77 men were killed, 152 were wounded, and 38 were missing. More than half the assault force was gone. But the point had been held, the guns had been destroyed, and every German counterattack had failed to throw the Rangers into the sea. There is a phrase attached to the Rangers that was born on those beaches, and it is worth telling accurately, because the true version is better than the legend. It happened not at the point but a few miles east, on Omaha Beach, where the whole invasion hung in the balance in the first hours, men pinned at the water's edge and unable to move up the bluffs. Not all of Rudder's Rangers had gone to the point. Other Rangers, and the men of the 5th Ranger Battalion, had come ashore at Omaha into that chaos, and it was there that the moment happened. An American general, Norman Cotter, the assistant commander of the 29th Infantry Division, was moving among the pinned men under fire, trying to get the attack unstuck. He came upon a group of Rangers, asked what unit they were, and when he learned they were Rangers, he told them, in words that have come down to us with some variation, that if they were Rangers, then they should lead the way. Rangers lead the way. It became the motto of the Rangers from that day. And the quiet irony that the historians point out is that it was Cotter himself, an ordinary infantry general and not a ranger at all, who was out front leading when he said it. He earned the nation's second highest award for valor for his own conduct on that beach. The point is not that the Rangers were the only brave men on the coast that day. Countless ordinary soldiers did extraordinary things. The point is what made the Rangers different as a system, and that difference showed itself most clearly in what the Germans said afterward. So much for the popular idea of German terror in Normandy. Which brings us to something that has to be said plainly, because this story is worth telling honestly. It is tempting, in accounts like this, to invent a frightened German watching through binoculars, or to reach for a dreadful nickname the enemy supposedly gave the Rangers. The honest truth is that the German records of these fights are thin, and much of what circulates is legend. There is no reliable German document that hands the Rangers a terrifying name. What there is that one real recorded complaint from German prisoners that the Americans did not attack the way soldiers were supposed to attack, that instead of coming through the fields, the crazy Americans came down the road. That is not the language of terror. It is the language of bafflement, of professional soldiers who had prepared carefully for one kind of enemy and met another. And that bafflement is the real story, far more than any invented dread, because it points at something the Germans could see the effects of, but could not easily copy. They could see that these Americans did not stop when the plan broke. What they could not do was rebuild their own army around that idea in the middle of a war, because it would have meant tearing down one of the oldest walls in their military tradition, the wall between the officer who decides and the enlisted man who obeys. We will come back to that wall, because it is the deepest reason the Rangers were what they were. But first we have to follow them out of Normandy and into the forest where all of this was tested again, in the cold, at even closer range. After Normandy, the battered battalion was pulled back and rebuilt. Replacements came in and had to be brought up to the standard of the men who had climbed the cliff, and the survivors of that climb became the teachers and the steadying corps. This was another quiet strength of the way these units were built. A battalion could be gutted and then remade around its survivors, because the knowledge did not live only in a few irreplaceable officers. It lived in the sergeants and the veterans, and as long as some of them came through, they could pour what they knew into the new men and rebuild the whole. Rudder himself did not stay with the battalion to the end of the war. On the 7th of December 1944, the very day his Rangers were about to fight their hardest battle, he left to take command of a full infantry regiment, the 109th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division. 9 days later, the Germans launched their last great gamble in the West, the massive winter offensive through the Ardennes that Americans remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Rudder's regiment held part of the thin American line in Luxembourg when that storm broke, and it fought a series of hard delaying actions that helped disrupt the German timetable in its sector before being forced back. For his leadership there, he was decorated again and wounded again. So the man who had built the battalion moved up to command far more men in an even larger fight, and the Rangers went into the forest under other officers, but they carried his stamp in everything they did. And the forest they went into was one of the worst places the American army fought in the entire war. The Americans called it the Hurtgen Forest, and it has a grim name among historians for a simple, terrible reason. An enormous amount of blood bought a very small amount of ground. Division after division had been fed into that forest through the autumn and torn apart there. One infantry division after another went in, gained a few thousand yards of trees at the cost of thousands of men, and was pulled out spent, only for the next division to take its place and bleed in turn. By the time the Rangers arrived, the ground below Hill 400 was already littered with the wreckage and the dead of the units that had tried before them. It was a place designed by nature to favor the defender. Tall, dense fir trees blocked the sky and cut visibility to a few yards. When artillery shells struck the treetops, they burst overhead and rained steel and splintered wood down on men who had no overhead cover, so that hugging the ground, normally the safe thing to do under a barrage, became one of the most dangerous. The weather was cold and wet and turning to snow. Tanks struggled among the trees. The Germans had prepared the ground with mines and wire and pre-aimed fire, and they defended it hard, because behind the forest lay the Rudder River and the approach to the German heartland. Into this, in the first week of December, the Rangers were sent against a single objective that had come to control a whole stretch of the front. Just east of a village called Bergstein rose a hill, marked on the maps only by its height in meters, 400. The Germans called it the Castle Hill because a medieval fortress had once stood on its crown, though that fortress had been torn down and carried away for its stone centuries before, so that by 1944 only the bare, commanding height remained. And that height was the whole point. Most of the Hurtgen was blind country, forest closing in on every side. Hill 400 rose above the trees, and from its crown an observer could see across the Rudder Valley and the open ground beyond, the very ground the American advance would have to cross. As long as German observers held that hill, they could call down artillery on any American movement below with deadly accuracy. Other American units had taken the village and the low ground, but they could not hold securely while the enemy looked down on them from that summit. Several attempts on the hill had failed. The High Command decided it had to be taken and held, and the job went, as such jobs so often did, to the Rangers. Specifically to 2 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, Dog and Fox, each worn down by the autumn fighting to roughly 65 men, a combined force of about 130, ordered to take a fortified hill from a determined enemy and then hold it. They moved up in the darkness and the cold and formed at the base of the hill before first light on the 7th of December. One of the Dog Company men, Private First Class Melvin Potratz, later remembered his first sight of it in the grey dawn, the hill standing starkly ahead of them, wrapped in a misty fog. Ahead of them the slope rose largely open near the top, swept by German machine guns and covered by mortars and artillery that had the ground carefully registered. The Rangers understood the arithmetic. A slow advance up that slope, stopping for cover, would let the German gunners kill them at their leisure. So they chose the other thing, the thing that looked like madness from the enemy positions and was in fact a cold calculation. They would not creep, they would charge, cross the killing ground so fast that the enemy could not cut them all down, and be in among the German positions before the defenders could react. At 7:30 in the morning, the attack jumped off behind a rolling barrage. This was no small supporting fire. A forward observer, named Lieutenant Howard Kettlehut, directed the guns of a great mass of artillery, on the order of 18 battalions of every caliber, walking the explosions up the hill just ahead of the advancing men. And when the barrage lifted, the Rangers rose and went up the slope at a run, firing as they climbed and screaming as they went. Survivors described a wild, roaring charge, the men yelling as they ran straight into the fire, the sound of it rolling up the hill ahead of them. It was partly the discipline of the tactic, cross the ground fast and do not stop, and partly the raw human need to make noise in the face of terror, and partly a deliberate act of intimidation flung at the men waiting above. The effect on the defenders was real, and one of the Rangers put it into words better than any narrator could. Sergeant Hermann Stein, a veteran who had climbed the cliff at Point du Hoc and was now climbing this hill, described what he imagined the Germans must have felt watching more than 100 men come screaming up an open slope. He said that half of them ran and half of them gave up, because if you saw that many men coming at you acting like that, you would think they were out of their minds. The Rangers, he said, were yelling like crazy the whole way up. His words are the words of a Ranger picturing the enemy's shock, not a German account, but they capture the moment exactly. The German line on the forward slope did not hold. The Rangers went up and over and through, using rifles and grenades, and at the closest range, bayonets, and in a matter of minutes, an assault that should by every calculation have failed, had carried the crest. The first men to the top, among them Technical Sergeant William Petty, with his automatic rifle, Private William Anderson, and Private First Class Cloise Manning, found a German bunker dug into the summit behind heavy steel doors. Petty emptied a full magazine through a firing slit, while Anderson shoved grenades inside. Moments later, an enemy shell burst on the position and killed Anderson, who had gone up the hill as a private, only because he had been broken from sergeant for trouble in garrison, and who died at the very top, having led the way to it. The crest of Hill 400 was theirs, and they had taken it in about 30 minutes. But the cost of even that swift success was already plain in the thinned ranks. Of the 65 men of Dog Company who had started up the slope that morning, only around 55 reached the top, and the hardest part of the day had not yet begun. Taking it, exactly as at Pont du Hoc, was the easier part. Holding it became one of the most concentrated ordeals of endurance the battalion ever knew. The Germans holding this sector, men of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, understood the value of that hilltop as clearly as the Americans did, and they were determined to take it back. Almost as soon as the Rangers were on the crest, the German artillery began to fall, and it fell with an intensity the survivors remembered for the rest of their lives. Because the top of the hill was hard and rocky, the men could barely dig in, and there was almost no shelter from the shell fire that came in, hour after hour. Men were buried by near misses and dug out again, and between the barrages, and sometimes through them, the German infantry counterattacked, pushing up the slopes from more than one direction, so that the small force on top had to fight in several directions at once, and could never rest. The men who held that hill had names and hometowns and lives they had left behind. Captain Otto Masny commanded Fox Company in the assault. When the fighting on the crest had worn the two companies down and Masny was wounded, he started back down toward the village to bring up reinforcements in person, and on the way he was captured by the enemy. Command of the survivors passed down the chain, again and again, exactly as the training had built it to. When the commander of Dog Company was shot through the body and could no longer lead, Lieutenant Leonard Lomel, the same Bud Lomel who had destroyed the guns at Pont du Hoc and who had since been commissioned an officer out of the ranks, took over the company and was among the first men to the top of the hill. When a sergeant leading the Fox Company survivors could hold no longer, Lieutenant Richard Wintz, the company's executive officer, climbed the hill through the fire with a fresh radio and took command in his place. Each time a leader fell, the man next in line simply picked up the fight, without confusion and without waiting to be told, because every one of them had been trained to expect exactly this and to be ready for it. To the enemy it must have seemed that the defense had no single head to cut off. There was always another man ready to lead, and then another behind him. Through it all, one figure held the fight together on the crest. The battalion surgeon, Captain Walter Bloch, a man who had been a children's doctor in civilian life before he volunteered for this dangerous work, ran his aid station through the bombardment, treating the wounded who could be dragged to him. On the 8th of December, the aid station was struck by German fire, and Bloch was killed while doing his job. The official records of the United States Army Medical Service note his death on that hill plainly, the doctor killed among the men he was trying to save. The counterattacks came in waves across the 2 days, roughly 5 of them, each mounted by 100 to 150 men behind direct fire from guns and mortars. The heaviest of them came at 3 in the afternoon on the 8th of December, when the Germans attacked from all sides at once, and some of them pushed to within 100 yards of the church in the village that was being used as an aid station. That attack lasted 2 or 3 hours and was finally beaten back, in large part by the weight of American artillery that the observers on the hill kept calling down on the attackers. Through it all, the little garrison shrank. By the middle of the first day, the two companies, which had started at about 130 men, were down to around 32 still able to fight. By late afternoon, only about 25 remained on the crest. Lomel, wounded, and by then the last officer standing on the hill, held them together. Long afterward, he measured that day against everything else he had lived through, and he did not hesitate. The 6th of June, the day he climbed the cliff, he said, had not been his longest day. His worst day, he said, the hardest day of his life, was the 7th of December on that hill. From a man who had done what he had done at Pont du Hoc, that is a heavy verdict. When the counting was finally done for the two companies on Hill 400, the official record listed 23 men killed or dead of their wounds, 86 wounded, and 4 missing, which effectively destroyed the two companies as fighting units. Behind those numbers were particular men, Sergeant Murrell Stinnett of Fox Company, a young man from Norfolk, Virginia, was killed on the hill on the 7th of December. Private First Class Garnis Colden of the same company, a Wisconsin boy of 20, who had been born on a farm in the green country of the state's southwest, was mortally wounded and died of his wounds the following day. They were 2 among the 23, and every one of the 23 was a story like theirs, a hometown and a family, and a life that stopped on that hill, or in the days just after it. Late on the 8th of December, and into the 9th, the survivors were relieved at last by infantry of the 8th Infantry Division, and the handful of men still on their feet came down off the hill. They had held it against everything the Germans could throw at them, and then, in one of the bitter facts of that campaign, the ground could not be kept. Within days, the Germans retook the hill from the unit that relieved the Rangers, and the American army would not take Hill 400 again until February of the following year. The Rangers had done what they were asked to do. Holding the gain was beyond the power of the exhausted men who came after them. So we come to the question underneath this whole story. Why could the Germans not simply do what the Rangers did? They were skilled soldiers. In many ways, the German army was the most tactically capable force in the world, its small unit doctrine excellent, its soldiers well-trained and often brave to the very end. The answer has nothing to do with courage or skill, and everything to do with that wall. The German system placed the power of decision in the officer, and it guarded the line between officer and enlisted man as something close to sacred. To become a German officer was to enter a separate class, with its own schooling and its own idea of itself as the bearers of responsibility in battle. The enlisted man carried out orders. The non-commissioned officer led within a framework the officers built for him. When the officers were killed, and by the last year of the war they were killed in enormous numbers, the framework they carried died with them, and the men below often lost the ability to improvise, to adapt, to invent a new plan on the spot, because that had never been asked of them or allowed of them. The Americans, and the Rangers as the sharpest edge of the American way, had made a different bet. They had decided that leadership was not a birthright, and not a class but a skill, and a skill can be taught to anyone willing to learn it and trusted to use it. So they taught it downward, to sergeants and to privates, and they trained those men to expect the plan to fail and to carry the mission forward on their own when it did. That is why 2 sergeants could destroy the guns at Point du Hoc without an order, and why a second patrol of sergeants could arrive on its own and finish the job. That is why a lieutenant who had been a soda counter clerk in Baltimore could take over a leaderless company on the beach and lead it up the cliff. That is why the defense of Hill 400 did not collapse each time an officer fell, but simply passed the fight to the next man down, from a captain to a lieutenant to a sergeant to a private, without a pause. And that is the thing the Germans could see the results of but could not copy, because copying it would have meant tearing down the wall their whole tradition stood on. You cannot, in the middle of a losing war, rip out the foundation of your own army and pour a new one. Consider what the German system would have demanded of an ordinary German soldier in the same spot. A German sergeant, no matter how brave, had been trained his whole career to operate inside a framework that an officer built for him. If the officer was dead, and the framework no longer fit the situation in front of him, he had no permission, and often no training, to throw it out and build a new one on his own authority. That was an officer's job, and the system had spent years making sure he understood the difference. The American sergeant labored under no such limit. He had never been told that thinking was somebody else's work, and on both the cliff and the hill, that single difference, invisible on any map, decided who kept moving forward and who did not. That is the deepest reason these men were feared. Not for a slogan, and not for an invented nickname, but for a plain and stubborn fact. You could kill Rudder's Rangers, and the Germans killed a great many of them, more than half at the point, and most of 2 companies on the hill, but you could not make them stop. The mission simply kept moving forward, up the cliff, up the hill, into the fire, because the men had been built to carry it, whether or not anyone was left to command them. An enemy like that does not behave the way war says an enemy should behave. and soldiers give a wary, lasting respect to a thing they cannot explain and cannot stop. The men who did these things did not think of themselves as legends. Leonard Lomel, the sergeant who found the guns, survived the war. He had been wounded at the point, and wounded again on the hill, and both times he came through. He went home to New Jersey, and did what so many of that generation did. He put the war away and built an ordinary life on top of it. He went to school under the law that sent veterans to college, earned a law degree, became an attorney, married, raised 3 daughters, and built a respected practice in a New Jersey town, so that his neighbors knew him as a lawyer and not as the sergeant who may have done as much as any single man to protect the invasion beaches. For decades he rarely spoke of any of it. It was only late in his life, when historians came looking for the men of the point and wrote their stories down, that the full weight of what he had done became widely known, and even then he waved most of the praise away. He lived into his 90s and died at home. Through all of it, he never presented himself as anything more than a soldier who saw what needed doing and did it, because the officers were out of reach, and the guns were right there in front of him. When the men of that battalion talked about those days, that was almost always the note they struck. Not glory, and not hatred of the enemy, just the job in front of them, and the men on either side of them. James Earl Rudder, the coach from Texas who trained them and led them up the cliff, came home too. He had been wounded at Point du Hoc, and he had commanded that infantry regiment through the Battle of the Bulge to the end of the war in Europe, and he carried the marks of it in his body for the rest of his life. He did not retreat into quiet. He entered public life in Texas, and in the summer of 1959 he became the president of his old college, Texas A&M, the same corps of cadets that had turned a small-town boy into a citizen soldier, and in that office he did something that took a different kind of courage than climbing a cliff. Texas A&M in those years was a tradition-bound, all-male, military school, proud and set in its ways. Over the following years, Rudder led it through deep and not always welcome change. Under his leadership, the college moved to open its doors, admitting women and making membership in the cadet corps voluntary, and it moved, against real resistance, toward becoming a school open to all. It was slow, and it was contested, and it took a civilian kind of nerve. He was the same man who had stood bleeding in a command post on a French headland, unwilling to ask others to face what he would not, and he brought that same quality to a campus. He died in the spring of 1970, not yet 60 years old, and many who knew him believed the war had shortened his life. The belief that ran through everything he did, in uniform and out of it, was the belief this whole story is about, that the ability to lead is not born into a few, but can be built into the many. That, in the end, is what the German army ran into on the cliff and on the hill. Not a better class of soldier, and not a magic nickname, but an army that had taken the thing other armies reserved for a chosen few and handed it out to everyone, down to the last private on the automatic rifle. An army that expected its leaders to fall and trained every man to step into the gap, so that killing the man in front only brought forward the man behind him. The Germans prepared, with great care, for the war they expected, and then the crazy Americans came down the road. Thank you for spending this time with the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. They climbed a cliff that should not have been climbable, and held a hill that should not have been holdable, and more than half of them fell doing it, and most of the ones who lived rarely spoke of it again. If this story reached you, the best thing you can do is share it, so that these men are remembered by people who never learned their names in school. And if someone in your own family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up with, I would be glad if you told me about them below. Every one of those men carried a story like this one, and most of them carried it quietly to the end. Saying their names out loud is how we make sure it was not for nothing.